In 1950, Britain sported 38 different car manufacturers, each of which filled various roles and market segments to create competitive machines with names and brands that resonated across the globe, only for mismanagement, union strife, poor and outdated designs, a hesitancy to adopt innovative technology, and a fanatical desire to make a splash on the export market, leading to the entire collapse of the British motor industry in April 2005, while what few remain are either small firms working with a handful of engineers and designers or are under the ownership of foreign multinationals. While one of the more notable players in the British car industry was the Rootes Group, which itself struggled and collapsed into bankruptcy over the course of the 1950s, 60s and 70s, the face of the UK's terrible fall from grace in the motoring world was that of British Leyland, the nationalised car firm that held in its pocket most of the country's renowned marques, and had all the momentum of state funding to push itself into being one of the most forward-thinking and innovative car manufacturers in the world, but instead was the culmination of disastrous policies, personal feuds, and weak governance that was decades in the making. Britain's role in the motor industry goes right back to the original conception of internal combustion automobiles in the late 1800s, so much so that by the 1920s there were hundreds of individual car producers, big and small, peppered across the country, a majority of these firms being the brainchild of sole engineers and designers who hoped to make their fortune with the next innovation in mainstream motoring, while at the top of the hierarchy were the three domestic car builders, Austin, Morris and Hillman, who shared the market with American interloper Ford, which used Britain as the heart of its European operations and opened up a mass production facility for the Ford Model T in Trafford Park near Manchester, the only other major player in the UK motoring scene being Vauxhall, which from 1925 had been procured by General Motors alongside the German car maker Opel and was similarly used to house their European operations. Essentially, it was in this period that the seeds of the British car industry's inevitable collapse were sown, as unlike the United States, which saw a majority of the stronger marques such as Cadillac, Lincoln, Buick, Mercury and Oldsmobile acquired very early on by the largest car firms, thus resulting in the big three Detroit manufacturers of Ford, General Motors and Chrysler dominating the market through various sub-brands by the start of the 1950s, Britain maintained an unmanageable slew of dozens of individual car companies which remained highly suspicious of each other's practices, the most notable being the two monoliths of UK mass production car building, Austin and Morris, with company founders Herbert Austin and William Morris expending more of their resources trying to outdo one another rather than beating back the foreign competition, both firms being based in the West Midlands and thus fought tooth and nail for the same market sectors and customers. The Austin Motor Company had been founded in Longbridge, south of Birmingham, in December 1905 by engineer Herbert Austin, and was most famous for its Austin 7 small family car, a machine that revolutionised British and European motoring by presenting the first viable competitor to Ford's pioneering Model T, and at the same time adopted a pedal and gear configuration that would help form the basis of the modern driving arrangement, while Morris Motors Limited had been founded in 1912 by former bicycle seller and repairman William Morris, and had, in its bid to match Austin, created a slew of highly successful mass-production cars that included the Morris 8, while also introducing from 1924 a dedicated sports car division dubbed Morris Garages or MG, which would provide lightweight but nippy handling roadsters that were incredibly popular during the Roaring Twenties and even through the Great Depression, as they provided a cheaper alternative to high-end sports models built by the likes of Alfa Romeo and Bugatti. Into the mix, however, was plunged a man named Leonard Lord, a former engineer at Vickers and Daimler, who joined the ranks of Morris in 1923, proving his immediate worth following the firm's acquisition of the Wolseley Company in 1927, where he was able to comprehensively modernise that firm's production equipment, thus leading to his promotion to general manager, from where he ran the Morris main factory at Cowley near Oxford, his work at running the business being so effective that William Morris appointed him as managing director of Morris Motors itself, but soon developed a war of personalities that led ultimately to Lord resigning from the Morris firm in August 1936, his reputation meaning he was a hot commodity when it came to competently running a car firm, as observed by the 72-year-old Herbert Austin, who, having lost his only son in World War I, was seeking a replacement as company chairman in order to allow him to retire, poaching Lord and placing him as manager of the corporation, followed in 1938 as chairman of the company when Austin inevitably stepped down, leading to the volatile situation of Britain's two biggest mass-production car builders being run by two men who held deep-seated personal grudges against one another, thereby stifling any potential tie-ups or cooperation between the two companies. By the time of World War II's end in 1945, the Morris Company had, from 1943, expanded its influence into a dedicated umbrella group under which the submarques of the firm were held, this organisation being dubbed the Nuffield Group, and derived its name from William Morris's peerage title as the Viscount Nuffield, which was established in 1938, with Morris restarting production of the pre-war Morris 8 and 10 models, while introducing among the wider Nuffield group a primitive form of badge engineering so as to save the cost of creating dedicated models for each of the individual marks, but these proved to be merely a stopgap as the company developed what would be perhaps its crowning achievement, the Morris Minor of 1948, a small family car designed by the then largely unknown engineer Alec Issigonis, this model adopting a simplistic Morris E-Series engine but incorporated advanced torsion bar independent front suspension and rack and pinion steering, while also boasting a low center of gravity, a monocoque chassis construction, and 14-inch wheels that were specifically developed for the car. The overwhelmingly positive reception for the Minor by both the public and press, causing the car to become the first British-built model to sell over 1 million units, and launching Issigonis to be one of the highest demand car designers in Britain. Although not long after the release of his creation, he decided to move on from Morris and join the ranks of Alvis instead. Austin, meanwhile, similarly restarted car production with pre-war models, but rapidly moved to create new models that incorporated the underpinnings of older vehicles, examples including their initial Austin 16, which adopted the body and chassis of the 1940 Austin 12, although by 1948 the company had introduced a slew of genuinely new cars, including the Princess, the A125 Shearline, the A70 Hampshire, and the 1.2-litre A40 Devon, while also demonstrating, for the first time, the fervent desire of Britain's car makers to appeal to the American market by way of the Austin A90 Atlantic, possessing a somewhat transatlantic styling intended to appeal to customers both in the United States and Britain, but ultimately failed to endear itself to potential buyers on either side of the pond, a situation that would be repeated time and again over the course of the next several decades. Although much of the incentive to want to take the foreign market by storm stemmed from the national policies of Labour Prime Minister Clement Attlee, who demanded that British car makers focus as much of their resources as possible into selling export models in exchange for increasingly generous allocations of steel rations based on their success, while foreign intervention onto the UK market itself was stymied by stiff import tariffs being placed on models not built on British soil, creating an artificially inflated domestic market that was strongly in favour of the UK car industry, but opened up each of the individual firms to bad habits and complacence. Aside from attempting to woo the North American market, the British Empire was also an initially strong export market for UK car builders, but as the cries of independence resonated across the post-war world, the colonial powers rapidly dissolved throughout the course of the 1950s, with many newly independent nations implementing boycotts on the import of British products due to ongoing resentment, and thus losing a major export market for the likes of Austin and Morris, this coinciding with the formation of the European Economic Community, or EEC, during 1958, which was established in order to allow member states to compete industrially and economically on equal terms, permitting the European car manufacturers of Germany, France, Italy, and Scandinavia the ability to trade freely with each other, while Britain was denied entry into the EEC when it applied in 1963 and 1967, thanks in no small part to the intervention of French President and former wartime leader of the Free French, Charles de Gaulle, who held a strong disdain for the UK and feared that, with its entry into the EEC, it would demand its own conditions that directly contravened those of the wider European community. Back at Austin and Morris, years of blood feud between both parties had resulted in their products being built not to compete with the likes of Ford, Vauxhall, or the Rootes Group, but instead with each other specifically, meaning their rivals could easily fill gaps in the market not served by either company. This self-destructive competition ultimately leading, in 1951, to both manufacturers agreeing to merge into a single firm, dubbed the British Motor Corporation, or BMC, a large-scale manufacturer that would rival Ford in terms of size and product range, and thus create the fourth largest car builder in the world, the company's establishment being completed by August 1952, and thus merged the various assets of Austin with the rabbit warren of brands under the Nuffield Group banner, the founding of BMC being made on fairly sensible principles, and should have, at the first opportunity, worked to root out those marks which were weaker in order to cut down the cost and complexity of the scheme, while at the same time reorganizing the surviving marks to match their respective market segments. Instead, following the retirement of the 75-year-old William Morris as BMC's first president, Leonard Lord quickly stepped into the role and immediately set about maintaining the bad blood he had previously held with Morris directly, placing as many advantages as possible in Austin's court by appointing former Austin executives to nearly every key management position, replacing all Morris power units with Austin ones, even when fitted to Morris-badged cars, and gradually transferring Morris's car design and drawing office elements from Cowley to Longbridge, thus robbing Morris of any ability for it to design models on its own terms, while being forced to keep older cars on sale for unrealistically long durations, this being most notable with the iconic Morris Minor of 1948, which, in a healthy car industry, would have either been replaced or facelifted during the mid to late 1950s, but was instead kept in production by BMC until as late as 1971. The general attitude among the former Morris staff being that what was pitched to them as an equitable merger was in fact a hostile takeover by Austin, and they immediately became defensive of their own roles within the corporation. This desire to keep alive the notion that Austin was better than Morris, as engendered by Lord, meaning integration between the various workforces failed to materialize, and a strong sense of them and us within the ranks soon became the ingrained culture of BMC, with dealer principals remaining firm in their insistence that a separate network of showrooms and salesmen be maintained, and that all cars being built have separate and distinct model ranges to sell. In terms of products, while the Morris Minor was an early commercial victory for BMC, the remainder of the 1950s and 60s was a mixed bag. An early attempt to create a dedicated export model in the form of the Nash Metropolitan, a stylish economy car built by Austin at their Longbridge factory near Birmingham, and distributed in the United States by the domestic Nash Motor Company, proving to be a somewhat modest success, but didn't perform in the manner hoped by the Austin sales team, though this was offset during 1959 by the launch of the Austin Mini, a car built to meet the needs of customers during a period of fuel rationing caused by the 1956 Suez Crisis, and one that would see enormous success across the globe thanks to its perfect mixture of practicality and charming style, although the reality was that the Mini had been an incredibly rushed product forced rapidly through development at Lord's insistence so as not to lose the fuel crisis market, its complex mechanics and production ultimately leading to BMC making a loss of £30 per car, or £535 in 2023. Nevertheless, the Mini was still a major winner for BMC, which, coupled to the later launch of the Austin and Morris 1100 during August 1962, saw the prestige of the British firm raised to the same standards as other more notable car builders, such as Mercedes-Benz, Citroën, Ford, Alfa Romeo and Volkswagen. But with this prestige came expectations to deliver highly innovative and well-built cars in the same manner as its stablemates, a task to which the archaic building facilities and corporate management was not equipped to handle, as embodied by the continued pushing of the Morris brand further out of the mainstream picture until it was left simply hanging on to the wider BMC firm as a badge-engineered subsidiary. Attempts to wrap up the Morris mark and simply create a single BMC brand being blocked by the unreasonably influential car dealers who, thanks to their direct connection with Lord, ensured that not only were Austin and Morris models kept separate, but that the management accept that the corporation required autonomous dealer networks to sell them, the idea of separate franchises and separate model ranges having been derived largely from the business model of General Motors in America, but could not be implemented easily for BMC, as the firm was effectively just an extension of the Austin empire at Longbridge, meaning that, unlike General Motors, which provided separate company managements for its various divisions, despite sharing models and components, BMC was operated by a single company board that was firmly in Austin's favor, thus creating a business with a corporate tree that grew from two main sources rather than one strong single foundation. And by the end of the 1960s, the company was operating 42 individual assembly plants and factories that were becoming increasingly difficult to administer from its headquarters in Longbridge. Regardless, the Austin-favored trimming down of former Morris assets continued, allowing for huge economies of scale to be maintained by the widespread engine sharing of Austin power units, with dealers remaining satisfied in the fact that they could sell both a full range of Austin and Morris cars to customers who were exceptionally brand loyal, and would buy individual Morris and Austin badged cars regardless of whether they were simply the same machine but with a different logo on the bonnet, this period being perhaps the most harmonious in BMC's turbulent tenure, as, at the very least, it meant the management were ensuring that as much resource sharing as possible took place, and allowed for cars to be produced for both brands as economically as possible, the reality being that BMC was only being kept afloat by the economic miracle that was the policies of Conservative Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, who, under the title of the New Approach, sought to bring unemployment to its lowest possible level and support the working classes by reducing inflation, bringing down the cost of borrowing, and allow for more public expenditure on housing and benefits for the needy, causing the standard of living across the UK to rise, and allowed for many working-class families to buy, for the first time, a brand new car thanks to the significant post-war boom, creating a strong seller's market as car ownership rose exponentially, with BMC selling their models wherever they wanted, and thereby resulting in their domination of 39% in the UK domestic car market, with profits assured. However, this short-lived boom period and artificially inflated market meant many of the critical decisions needed to secure a viable economic and managerial future for the firm were deferred, as executives, emboldened by this sudden burst in their sales performance, felt that making such rash corporate choices were no longer required, and that they would be revisited only if absolutely necessary. The only major issue to queer this otherwise superb era for the car maker being the prevalent problem of strike action, the magnitude of which, especially in the ranks of BMC, being demonstrated in that, for all strikes within the British motor industry between 1946 and 1964, 44% of all instances of industrial action had taken place within the company's plants, while the rival Ford of Britain only comprised 11% of all strike action experienced, the causes for this being generally attributed to BMC retaining the complex piecework system of payment, in contrast to Ford, who paid their employees through measured day work, this piecework system also existing in the factories of Standard Triumph, Rover and Jaguar. Industrial unrest increased throughout the 1960s across the entire British car industry, as for each of their own reasons, the trade unions butted heads with the management of various companies, this being illustrated in the ranks of the premier Rover Company, which was riddled with disputes and industrial strife when they proposed upping the production rate of their best-selling P6 Saloon, one of the defining cars of the decade, while Jaguar was also facing its own spate of industrial action due to a large rift between company chairman Sir William Lyons and the workforce, culminating in a 3-week strike during June 1965, when 2 polishers refused to do a 3-minute job that was sent back to them as below standard, leading to the entire polishing detail of 60 men stopping all work in protest, and thus leaving the remaining 2,500-man workforce of the Browns Lane factory idle, as they could not proceed with the car assembly process without the polishers. While one may be forgiven for thinking that the root of all problems within the British motor industry were caused by militant trade unions, funded by subversive communist factions which even included the Soviet Union, in the early 1960s, before the advent of mechanized assembly or even a basic health and safety regimen, car factories were dirty, noisy and cramped places where severe workplace injuries were a day-to-day part of the business, while even without the dangerous working environment, the presence of harmful materials such as asbestos, solvents and pollutant machinery exhausts meant respiratory problems and cancers were rampant among the workforce, which, in combination with a widening of the divisions between the general employees and the management, who were perceived to be the rich men on high that refused to associate themselves with the line workers and could have them dismissed at a stroke, as was the case when BMC brutally sacked 10,000 employees during the autumn of 1966, only served to strengthen the resolve of the trade unions and create an air of distrust between the management and worker levels. By the end of the 1960s, the 3 leading trade unions of the British car industry were the Amalgamated Union of Engineering Workers, the Transport and General Workers Union, and the National Union of Vehicle Builders, none of whom cooperated with each other to work for better working conditions and were more in rivalry for prestige, as demonstrated in August 1969, when the leaders of each union met at the former Triumph factory in Candley to discuss whose members should tighten the screws on the dashboards of Triumph 2000 saloon cars, with the AUEW considering itself the most important union of them all, as it was comprised mainly of skilled workers including electrical engineers and precision mechanics, and thus demanded the highest raises in salaries when compared to the 2 other unions, which eventually forced the absorption of the TGWU by the NUVB in 1972, so as to combine their influence and vie for salaries that were on par with the opposing AUEW. This demand for increased pay, largely fueled by a matter of working-class pride between the disputing unions, being the root cause of much of the industrial strife that would litter the legacy of the UK car industry for the next decade. The rampant influence of the trade unions within the car industry wasn't helped by the weak government of Labour Prime Minister Harold Wilson, who attempted to dispense with the piecework system and accept a measured day work method during 1968, only to face an outright rebuttal, the power the trade unions had in holding the nation hostage being illustrated vividly during the 1966 Seamen's strike, when the National Union of Seamen, or NUS, launched its first strike since 1911 in order to secure higher wages and reduce the working week from 56 to 40 hours, a crisis that severely damaged the already fragile economy of the UK and led to a state of emergency being declared. Any proposals to curb the control of the unions, as per the 1969 In Place of Strife White Paper, drafted by Wilson and Transport Secretary Barbara Castle, being abandoned due to members of the Labour cabinet, who had vested interests in the unions, seeing it as an attack on the working class. Exacerbating the influence of the unions was Lord's mismanagement of the strikers early on, as while many foreign car builders, including Nissan and Volkswagen, opted to face the strikers head-to-head and reach a compromise that wasn't an all-out surrender, Lord, following a demand for pay settlements by the unions, no matter how inappropriate, was forced to cave in because the costs of these wage settlements would be outweighed by the potential cost to BMC through built cars lost, with Lord's pride refusing to allow even one potential car sale to be surrendered, regardless of the price. While in 1956, during a particularly disruptive strike, Lord sent Joe Edwards, managing director of the Press Steel Company, to settle a deal with the union, a task to which Edwards immediately objected, as he was a production manager and not a worker relations expert, leading to his ultimate resignation when Lord refused to budge on the matter. Edwards' departure not only losing the company a popular man among the workforce, but also an innovative designer who had many strong concepts that could have revitalized the product list, including a much-needed replacement for the Morris Minor that was planned for release as early as 1959. The loss of Edwards leading ultimately to Lord introducing badge engineering on a vast scale, coming initially in the form of the Farina saloons that had been penned by the Italian Carrozzeria Pininfarina, the success of which led to a new corporate direction for the 1960s that would see badge-engineered cars be launched that were outwardly stunning due to their Italian styling, but beneath were painfully conventional in terms of mechanics and underpinnings. Nevertheless, productivity went through the roof, and for 1960 the British motor industry enjoyed its absolute zenith year, with 1.36 million units built and sold, although this glorious moment appeared to be fleeting, as for 1961 this figure dropped to just marginally over 1 million cars, pushing Britain into third place behind West Germany and France as the largest car-building country in Europe. Though regardless, BMC, under managing director George Harriman, opted to undertake a huge expansion plan following the highly ambitious announcement that it would produce at least 1 million vehicles a year, as supported by a £49 million government-assisted programme, which involved the opening of new factories in Llanelli near Swansea, Bathgate to the west of Edinburgh, and Ravenscraig to the southeast of Glasgow, all of which was done as part of a wider government initiative to invest in areas of the UK suffering from significant economic deprivation and unemployment. The results of this investment seeing BMC's output jump to a record 731,000 cars per year by 1964, but failed to address the most fundamental problems with the company, in that, following the launch of the Austin 1100 in 1962 and the Austin 1800 in 1964, no comprehensively new cars that extended beyond simple cosmetic or stylistic changes to existing models were in the pipeline for release during the mid to late 1960s, while the creation of new factories further and further away from BMC's West Midlands heartland only served to overstretch the management's abilities to provide strong leadership, and thereby leading to human resources being overworked and industrial relations suffering, as employees felt underrepresented within the firm. The biggest problem, however, was the fact that the company was needlessly losing profits, regardless of the fact that it was building nearly 1 million cars per year, as aside from BMC receiving thousands of warranty claims due to the shambolic build quality of its cars, a deep-seated policy as dictated by Leonard Lord himself, as carried over from his days rivaling Morris, was to ensure that his cars were the cheapest in their class, no matter what the profit implications, with the likes of the Mini and 1100, regardless of the fact that they had no direct rivals, being priced in such a cutthroat manner that, in terms of financial performance, BMC had made a total of £26 million profit on cumulative Mini sales, amounting to £347 million for 1960, but by 1967 was making an overall loss of £3 million on total sales that amounted to £467 million, despite the fact that more Minis were being sold than ever before. BMC's inability to break Lord's stringent pricing conventions, in a time when the company was selling at the best performance in its entire history, meaning the potential profits reaped by this enormous success were less than half what they could have been, and in turn led to the company being unable to invest in forward planning, the focus of the firm's management instead being squarely set on undercutting the competition and making as much money as possible in the here and now. Eventually, Leonard Lord stepped down as chairman of BMC on his 65th birthday, November 15, 1961, leaving the company in the charge of George Harriman, who had gradually been taking over a majority of the company's executive roles since 1956, although Lord would retain the role of vice chairman until his death in 1967, while Harriman's policy was to ensure that Alec Isagonis, father of the Mini as well as many of BMC's other highly profitable models, was promoted to technical director of BMC, ensuring that these two men alone would dictate the future of the corporation, sharing a close relationship, but in so doing having a strong influence on the development of future models, as was the case with the ADO 17 or Austin 1800, a family car that was styled to look larger than it actually was, and thus gave customers the incorrect perception that they were buying a large saloon rather than a mid-sized car, which, coupled to an impossibly ambitious sales output of 4,000 cars per week, led to a sales calamity upon its launch in 1964, as it was seen as too big to be a mid-range saloon, but was too small to be considered a large car. The failure of the 1800 to meet its quotas, meaning that the models it intended to replace, including the Farina saloons and the ever-present Morris Minor, could not be removed from the product lists, as they were in fact selling better than the brand new car. The downturn in sales for 1965 being brushed off by Harriman as simply a downturn in the wider market, though by this point he too had realized that BMC had no forward planning to speak of, and no upcoming models with comprehensively modern underpinnings in the pipeline that could be delivered before 1970. In the midst of a new development and research department being formed under the direction of planning director Geoffrey Rose, which was manned mostly by inexperienced graduates and was but a fraction of the size of the market research division at the rival Ford, 1965 saw BMC gain unassailable control of the British auto industry when, despite continued internal inefficiencies, the company purchased the Press Steel firm of Oxford, which was later merged with Fisher and Ludlow to become Press Steel Fisher, so as to bring the manufacture of the company's body shells in-house, this move being seen by those outside the company as a major step forward, as it was undertaken using nothing more than the company's own funds, and would provide an additional source of income from Press Steel's other customers, although the latter point was one of significant note, as with BMC now in charge of Press Steel, they had access to inside knowledge of what the opposition were planning to build in the future, and, more importantly, how much it was costing them to do so. Press Steel also being the body shell manufacturers for the Rootes Group, Jaguar, Rover, Rolls-Royce, and the Leyland Group, an incredible and severely unfair advantage that, in the end, was never truly exploited by BMC, so as to try and undercut or even sabotage their opponents. In June 1966, Joe Edwards was brought back aboard by Harriman and made managing director, and immediately set about identifying the firm's insurmountable number of problems, including excess capacity that caused factories to be seriously overmanned, and thus led to the not uncommon sight of 12 men performing the work of 6, as well as prolonged neglect at the Longbridge factory that had left the workforce undermotivated and less productive than they should have been, his solution being to administer a series of cuts so as to improve the corporate health of BMC, including the axing of 14,000 jobs and a spate of factory closures, the most notable of which were the body plants at Coventry and Castle Bromwich. While much to his horror, he found that due to the short-sightedness of Harriman and Issigonis, there was absolutely no forward planning for the firm, and what little existed had been based more on instinct rather than taking the pulse of what customers desired in a modern car, Edwards demanding an immediate front-end restyle for the upcoming Austin Maxi to spruce up its archaic image, only to find it was far too late to revise the model, as the body pressings for the Maxi had already been signed off, and Press Steel was gearing up to produce bodies in white. Although one of the few successes he could accomplish, based on his limited abilities, was to commission newly recruited ex-Ford designer Roy Haynes to facelift the Mini into what would become the Mini Clubman, while Alec Issigonis worked on his own unofficial Mini replacement dubbed the 9X. More notable, however, was, only a month after Edwards' return to BMC, the merger of Jaguar into the company's ranks at a cost of £18.2 million. The reasons as to the sale of the company to the Longbridge giant being due to the company founder, Sir William Lyons, not wanting Jaguar to lose its identity as per the terms of an earlier deal he had made to merge with the Leyland Group, as headed by Donald Stokes. Other incentives being Lyons having no one to succeed him as company chairman following the death of his son in May 1955, the need for Jaguar to secure its body supply due to fears that BMC might cut off their main provider at Press Steel and thus hold the company for ransom, and the need to acquire additional funds so as to bring the upcoming XJ4 saloon to production. Jaguar, despite its strong reputation for luxury sports cars and saloons, being a comparatively weak seller and barely making any profits, even on its venerable E-Type, the result being the rebranding of the British Motor Corporation into British Motor Holdings or BMH, the acquisition of Jaguar leading to a confusing reorganisation of the product range, as Lyons refused to surrender all of his influence upon taking a seat on the BMH company board, with the proviso being that, in exchange for Jaguar now providing large luxury saloons, such as the upcoming Daimler DS420, BMH would not build a car larger than the Austin 1800, though this news came too late for the top-end Austin 3-litre saloon, due to its progression in development, for which it would go on to have an inauspicious sales life of 4 years and less than 10,000 units produced. The reality was, however, that Harriman had not appreciated his advantageous position when compared to Jaguar, but rather than asserting himself and ensuring that Jaguar fell into line with the other elements of BMH, he instead allowed them a degree of autonomy that essentially meant they remained a largely independent firm both during and after the merger, Lyons wooing the BMC chairman with the prospect that his wizardry in expanding Jaguar to an unprecedented scale over the previous 15 years, with production figures jumping from 6,647 in 1950 to 25,963 by 1965, could be applied to his own firm, with more product-led growth to come, especially now that the world-beating E-Type and Mark II were now within the ranks of Harriman's corporation. Though before any of these prospects could come to pass, more significant changes in the UK's motoring market were afoot that would ultimately change the face of the British auto industry, and thereby lead to the culmination of the many corporate inefficiencies and missed opportunities coming back to haunt the management with a terrible bite.